Welcome to FEMA's Public Assistance Program webinars, presented by the Public Assistance Training section. This webinar is a part of the Understanding Public Assistance for Applicants webinar series created to give state, local, tribal, and territorial public assistance applicants a better understanding of the PA program. The information presented in this webinar is accurate up to version 4 of the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide.
So we're going to get started with our Public Assistance 101. So this is a series that we're trying to offer, getting everyone a little bit more in-depth knowledge on the different sides of the public assistance program. We're going to focus on Category A today, or debris removal. So public assistance funding may be provided for the removal of debris and associated operations when that debris is a direct result of a federally declared event and that debris is impacting your community. Debris includes, but is not limited to, vegetative debris, construction and demolition debris, sand, mud, silt, gravel, rocks, boulders. That's all, maybe from a landslide or from a severe flood. White goods, we'll go a little bit more in depth into that later as well, and vehicle and vessel wreckage. So anything that you could possibly think of as being caused by a federally declared event, potentially you could receive public assistance funding for the removal of that in order to help your community recover. I'm going to lay out how the class is going to go today. So we're going to talk about planning. Then once you've got your debris planned for, we're then going to talk about what kind of debris you can pick up, so eligibility. Then once you know what kind of debris you can pick up, you can estimate those totals because a Category A can be funded on estimates. Then we're going to talk about monitoring, which is going to be a really huge part of where people run into issues with Category A debris removal projects, and procurement, which is how you can get some additional help with your debris removal. And then we'll talk about special considerations and special circumstances around debris removal operations. So let's jump into planning. The importance of having a plan. Failure to plan is planning to fail, right? You really want to make sure you have a plan because that facilitates your recovery. It helps your community members get back into the swing of things quicker. Students can return to class if we're in normal operating environments. People can return to their jobs if the debris is removed from, the roadway or the university. Helps the community return to normalcy more quickly. Having a plan also helps reduce impacts to humans and the environment. So if you have a plan on where to put, your debris piles before you bring them into the landfill, or if you need like a temporary staging area, you want to make sure you have a plan for that. Because if you don't, you could potentially put it on an endangered habitat, or maybe the only place you can put it because you haven't planned beforehand is a kid's soccer field. And so you won't be able to, the kids won't be able to utilize that field because you're using it because of the emergency. So making sure you have an idea of, temporary staging sites that will have the lowest impact on your community, as well as ensuring effective use of resources. So if you wait until the last possible moment to purchase something, it usually costs a lot more. Same thing with procurement. If you're doing emergency procuring, if you're hiring a contractor at the last moment in emergency circumstances, it's going to be a lot more expensive for your community. So having a plan and having those resources set out ahead of time really helps you control the cost and ensure effective use of resources. So having a plan is super duper important. A debris management plan, in addition to all of those other things I talked about, also helps you answer some really important questions. So who, what, when, how, and where after an event. And that's what's really important for documentation as well. Debris removal projects are some of the largest projects that we have in public assistance. So making sure that you have a plan that analyzes who, what, when, how, and where after the event also will help you with your documentation requirements later on. So you're going to have to track time. You're going to have to track what you picked up and from where. So having that already set out in a plan could be really beneficial as well. So important considerations to have in your plan: events and assumptions. So what are the likely events that you are going to experience, and what are the assumptions that go along with that? If you are in Florida, like me, you're going to have to accommodate for hurricanes, less so for tornadoes. So we only have a tornado once in a blue moon, at least in my hometown. So we're going to really have to plan for flooding and hurricanes, and that produces different types of debris than wildfires that come out from the wildlands, like in California, or earthquakes or ice storms. Ice storms have a different type of debris than hurricanes do. So making sure you understand and have a basic set of assumptions of what kind of a debris you're going to experience in your community. And then how are you going to collect that debris that results from those events? So are you going to have people bring the debris to a temporary staging site, and then from there you're going to take it to the county landfill? Or are you going to have a 30-day period where you're going to collect debris from the public right-of-way, and then you're going to cut it off and then have the community bring the debris to the temporary staging site? So that kind of thing, you have to establish those parameters and think about how your community would best be able to recover in a moderate event or in a large scale event. So are you going to have those debris collection sites or debris management sites and disposal locations? Where are they going to be? When I was working out in Kansas, there was these particular counties would have some bits of land that were right on the county line where people could come and bring their debris, and then once a week they'd come and pick up that debris and take it to the county landfill. Planning for that kind of thing and making sure it's all within your jurisdiction, within your legal responsibility. So if it's a large scale event too, are you going to request debris removal from private property? So how is your community going to deal with debris that's on their own land or on commercial property? If it's a large scale wildfire, there's going to be a lot of debris on private property. How are you going to accommodate for that? Then procurement and contracted services and use of force account labor. So who is picking up that debris? We'll talk a ton more about procurement later, but kind of thinking about force account labor. What staff do you have? What are their specialties? So making sure that you're able to accommodate for your own staff, and if you need to hire additional people for monitoring or for picking up the debris, how are you going to start that process? And then monitoring of debris operations. Super duper important, that sometimes gets kind of left off of the discussion. So you need to be able to account for cradle to grave the entire operation, especially if you procure or ask a contractor to come in and help you with the debris operations. So how are you going to monitor your contractors that you hire? So that's what your debris plan should contain. And now we're going to look a little bit about those assumptions that we talked about. So this is a handy graph or chart that talks about different events and what are the assumptions that go along with those types of events. So with hurricanes, you're going to have pretty much every type of debris: vegetative, construction, demolition, personal property, hazardous materials, white goods, sandbags. You're going to have everything start to finish probably. What you may not have with an earthquake is you may not have those sandbags, and you probably won't have putrescent debris because you don't have a flood wiping through the area and bringing lots of farm animals into your community center potentially. Usually animals are pretty handy. They can sense those seismic vibrations. Same thing with wildfires or ice storms. There's different types of assumptions that go along with those types of debris. And this is a nice handy chart that helps you figure that out. This is from one of the debris monitoring classes, the debris management plan class that you can request from your recipient. It's also, there are independent study classes that we have on our Emergency Management Institute website that will also cover some debris management plans. So next step in the plan that's really important is public information. The dissemination of debris removal information is critical to the effective and efficient removal of disaster debris. Local governments and large organizations should have an information strategy. It's really helpful. It really gets you towards that recovery step. Local governments and organizations should have a public information strategy to ensure that residents receive accurate and timely information about the parameters, rules, and guidelines of debris removal. Here, organizations that could potentially submit a Category A and be eligible for public assistance are certain private nonprofits. So in this consideration, you'd think university systems or large hospitals, things that have, facilities that maybe have a lot of land or need some sort of debris management plan. School districts will potentially have to have a debris management plan, especially, again, in states that are impacted by hurricanes or by wildfires. There should be some sort of debris management plan, and could potentially submit a Category A for that claim. Important considerations with the information strategy would be one, centralized information center or person, and then one spokesperson, like I was saying, to decrease potential for misinformation. So a public information officer or a public information team can be really important to get the information out there. A public information office will help you disseminate information. So if possible, you want to have a pre-disaster strategy, because the dissemination of debris removal information is super important to get the information out there, to help the community know, how to separate their debris, where to place their debris on the roadside, what is the timeline in which you as the community government or community organization are going to pick up debris. So if you want your community to bring their debris into the public right-of-way for week 1 through 3 after an event, how are you going to publicize that? So are you going to have door hangers? Are you going to maybe get on some local radio shows and get that information out that way? Are you going to have newspaper announcements? Are you going to talk about it on your Facebook, do a Facebook Live event, on Twitter, publicize those dates? Making sure you track how you publicize it and have at least a copy of the timelines that you've set out for your community is going to be really important to your project later on as well. So in addition to deciding how that information gets out, preparing that information, communicating that information, and distributing that information, you're also going to want to have procedures to update that information. So maybe your PIO, your public information officer, won a sweepstakes and goes on a cruise for like 3 weeks. How are you going to update the information after they're gone? Also making sure you have a venue to address concerns. So if you are picking up debris for a 3-week period and maybe the community notices like, hey, during week 2, the debris truck only passed my house once. So how are you going to accept complaints or concerns and then remedy those concerns? You should have an established way to do that, whether it's a hotline or people commenting. Again, like we're going to talk about some new media here. If people are going to comment on your Facebook page, but still, either way, making sure that you have some sort of way of collecting that information. Also making sure that your public information office or officer maintains contact with the emergency management officials in your organization or in your community, as well as elected officials, state and local officials, and media outlets. So are you sending out press releases, or are you, again, you're going to use Facebook. Are you going to post on Facebook? So how are you getting in contact with local media? Are you sending out press releases just to the local, NBC station, or are you making sure that the local radio station also has the press releases as well? So making sure that, again, you have those strategies. How to distribute, how to prepare it, and how to update it is very important, because the information you're disseminating is going to be vital to making sure that all of the debris that you collect is eligible. So making sure that your community knows how to separate debris, so making sure to keep hazardous waste, hazardous household waste separated from recyclable material, making sure vegetative debris is separated from your construction and demolition debris, and we'll talk a little bit more about the different types in a separation guide in 1 second. But you also want to, maybe have a little how-to or some sort of, again, video or list on how to place debris curbside. So what are the pickup schedules? When are you going to pick up the debris from different places in the community? How are your citizens going to separate the debris? How are they going to place it on curbside? I know in some communities you can only place it on, the left side of the road. So some houses have to share because, there could also be snow days coming by soon, or maybe parking is on the right side, so you have to place the debris on the right side. So really just making sure that information is disseminated. Also, again, like I was saying, how to report concerns. So making sure that your community knows how to report illegal dumping. Maybe your contractor is not picking up at the correct locations or dropping it off at the incorrect locations. Making sure that is able to be reported. And then also those locations with the debris handling and the debris staging sites. Those sites should be publicized as well, because you may have the community members, they have a pickup truck and they want to take debris from their own property and dump it at or place it at a temporary debris staging location after, a big hurricane or a big tornado. Or maybe they're helping out their neighborhood to try and get life back to normalcy as quickly as possible. So I've rambled on about that just about enough. This type of flyer can be posted at an emergency operations center, a disaster recovery center. This is an example of the type of flyer that you can have publicized in a newspaper, and again, just maybe on your Facebook page. But it really helps it doesn't have to be this flyer either. This is a flyer that's an example that we use in our classes. But it provides a handy guide to making sure that your debris is separated. Like I was saying a little bit earlier, but eligibility of debris is important, and how you separate it or making sure that it's separated can ensure that everything that's eligible can be claimed, and it's not a large burden on you to separate those debris out just in your paperwork rather than actually having it separated on the roadside. So vegetative debris, leaves, logs, plants, tree branches. Notice they have that handy hint there. Do not put leaves in bags. Construction and demolition debris, so building materials, carpet, drywall, furniture, appliances and white goods. If you're thinking about, early to late 90s, all of the appliances were all white. That's what we call white goods. Microwaves, refrigerators, washers, dryers. Now they're all like a sleek chrome color, so we may have to rethink that. But just thinking about appliances. Electronics need to be separated from white goods as well, and from construction. So electronics need to be their own special thing. There's lots of different chemicals that are flowing through the wires, different types of metals that are in the circuitry. So you really want to keep those separate because it could have hazardous materials in them. And then also, even in addition to that, household hazardous waste should be separated as well. Lawn chemicals, oil-based paints, stains and pesticides, cleaning supplies. And what's not mentioned on here that should also be separate is sandbags. So if a sandbag has encountered floodwater, you also want to make sure that's separated as well. We'll revisit that handout in a little bit, but now I want to talk about eligibility. So this section is going to cover generally where and what you can pick up, as well as who can do that labor. So if you think about eligibility, it is a pyramid. So everything kind of builds on top of each other. If you see here, it says applicant, facility, work, and cost. You have to be an eligible applicant before you can submit a public assistance project. So you have to have that approved request for public assistance. In an emergency work situation, which is category A, you may see another pyramid in the public assistance program and policy guide that includes a section for immediate threats. So once you're an eligible applicant, if you can show that the work you did and the cost that you incurred was because you were alleviating an immediate threat to your community, then that work could potentially be eligible. So you don't have to prove a eligible facility all the time. And generally, if you're a private nonprofit, though, you will have to prove that you have an eligible facility. But generally, for emergency protective measures, so category B, and also debris removal, which is category A, so any type of emergency work, you will, if you show that you're alleviating that immediate threat, you could potentially have an eligible project. And just the key here is you as the applicant are responsible for demonstrating that you meet each component with your supporting documentation. So we're going to talk a little bit about breaking up, we've talked already about breaking up the types of debris into the different sections, but we'll talk in in the next couple of slides about, budgeted and unbudgeted employees, and making sure that you can show that the people who are doing the work are eligible to do that work, and then that the costs are reasonable as well. And you as the applicant can provide some supporting documentation for that. So, minimum work eligibility, you got 3 things. So, required as a result of the disaster, located within the designated area, and the legal responsibility of an eligible applicant. So, it seems like a no-brainer, but you got to think about it a little bit too. So, like, required as a result of the disaster, it means the declared disaster. So let's say if you're in Louisiana and you've encountered 5 hurricanes this past season, which unfortunately we have, depending on what declaration you are submitting your Category A project for, you will have to demonstrate that it is the result of that particular event. So that is going to be something that you as an applicant will have to support. Also located within the designated area. So thinking about public assistance declarations. Public assistance declarations are by county. Once the state is declared, particular counties within a state are declared. So if your county is declared, but the county next door is not declared, you want to make sure you're not accidentally picking up some debris that's been pushed over the county line, because that would be an example of an ineligible debris pile. And then next would be the legal responsibility of the eligible applicant. So legal responsibility of you as your organization, local government, state government, tribal government. What is your responsibility? What is your jurisdictional area? And then demonstrating that. Let's say if you were a community center, you at the community center wouldn't then be able to go next door and pick up debris from the Pinch a Penny that's next door. You wouldn't be able to pick up their debris as well. That would not be your jurisdiction or your legal responsibility. So getting a little bit deeper into it like we just did, generally all disaster debris, if it's a result of that declared disaster, is eligible. You just, again, making sure that it's separated by type, but if you can record that is from that event, you could include it in your Category A. Also making sure that your debris work is closely managed by you, the applicant, and has established limits. So within established limits, you cannot collect debris for 2 years after a hurricane. You have to have that limit set for your community. So if you have an event, let's say, so that picture was May 4th, 2011. There was a storm and tornado system that swept through Concord, Alabama. Concord, Alabama would not be able to pick up the debris until, 3 years later, 2 years later. They would have to say, hey, so as a community, you're able to bring your debris into the right-of-way and we will pick up that debris for the next 2 months or 60 days. And they've publicized that in their newspaper and they've publicized that in radio announcements, and they can record that they have put established limits on that debris pickup. So that would be a way to show eligibility within established limits. And then also making sure that debris is separated from normal garbage pickup and other ineligible debris removal. So making sure that if it's just, some lawn clippings that were not from the disaster, making sure your community knows to separate that out. So speaking of deadlines, we do have some regulatory deadlines. Per 44 CFR 206.204 C1, all public assistance funded disaster removal projects must be completed within 6 months. The recipient, so the state, tribe, or territory that you are applying under, can then extend that for an additional 6 months. But anything after that 12-month period does have to go through FEMA for approval. So, why is it super important to pay attention to time limits? It is really important to have those established limits and to follow those timelines.
Because if you don't request an extension within that 6-month period,
anything you do after that 6-month period would not be eligible. So making sure that you pay attention to your deadlines and making sure you request extensions within the deadline will really ensure that you get the funding for what you're eligible for. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about eligible work. So if you notice that pyramid in the top right-hand corner, we're still in that work section on your pyramid. So reimbursement for straight time for force account labor. If you have past versions of the program and policy guide, or if your disaster is declared before June 2020, you're going to have to follow the Papagy version 3.1. So that version, you do have to opt in to seek reimbursement for straight time labor. There is a form that you have to fill out with your program delivery manager. After June 2020, you no longer have to sign that form and opt in. You just have to claim your straight time, and then that is you saying that you're participating in that reimbursement for straight time for force account labor. For budgeted and unbudgeted employees, when we talk about straight time and overtime, generally for emergency work, so that's category A and category B, only overtime is eligible for budgeted employees, but straight time, so regular time and overtime, is eligible for unbudgeted employees. And there's a really great chart for that in both the Papagy version 3.1 and the Papagy version 4. So the PA Program and Policy Guide has a lot of information about how to separate your budgeted versus unbudgeted employee. It's very detailed, but I will say go and check that out if you have any kind of questions about budgeted versus unbudgeted or overtime versus straight time. And I will say these alternative procedures do apply to both large and small grants. So you don't have to meet that large project threshold in order to get straight time reimbursement. So some eligible debris removal, so what we've been talking about. So any debris that eliminates immediate threat to lives, public health, and safety. And then you may be asked to support this or justify that, but if it eliminates immediate threats to lives, public health, and safety, could be an eligible debris project. Eliminating that immediate threat of significant damage to improved property or private property. So if you've got a bunch of debris sitting on top of a hill and it looks like it might cause a landslide or an avalanche at some point, making sure you eliminate that immediate threat of significant damage. And then also ensuring the economic recovery of the affected community to the benefit of the community at large. So making sure, and if you have any questions about if your debris is eligible or not, we do have, like I mentioned before, the Public Assistance Program and Policy Guide. You can also talk to your state or your program delivery manager if you have any eligibility questions. All right, and there's also ineligible debris removal, so debris from navigable channels or waterways that could be a responsibility of another federal organization, so the U.S. Coast Guard, or especially removal from agricultural lands, that could be the responsibility of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So making sure that you're not claiming stuff with FEMA that could be the responsibility of another federal agency, as well as what could be ineligible is debris from previous events, debris in an unmaintained area that's not threatening public property or economic recovery, and as well as debris from commercial properties. There may be certain situations where a state or a recipient, so the state, territorial, tribal government may say, we are instituting private property debris removal, and we'll talk a little bit more about that process at the very end. But there could be situations where they say, like, hey, we are going to do private property debris removal, and that's when some debris from private property will be eligible, but that does have to go through an approval process. So it can't just be you at your level saying, yep, that tree is in my way, I need to remove it. Keep in mind as we kind of work through this process, I am going to talk a little bit about the streamlined project application. What is eligible or ineligible has not changed. Now that we've instituted this streamlined project process, what's changed is how we gather that information and process that information. So with the category A, I'll show you a couple of screenshots of the category A. It just enables you to write your own application and enter the information on your own time, rather than having to wait for someone to enter that information for you. It will also give you an idea of what you need to track. So there are different considerations for each type of debris, but we're going to talk about vegetative and construction and demolition debris a little bit more in depth. Those are two of our more common debris types. So vegetative debris can include debris on public property and right-of-ways, hazardous trees, hazardous limbs, and hazardous stumps. So those are generally the types of debris, vegetative debris that you'll encounter. And that includes all types of woody or vegetative leaves, trees, stumps, stems, bushes, all of that is included in vegetative debris. So vegetative debris on public property and in right-of-ways, if you were writing that type of project, it's going to show up kind of like this. When you encounter the Streamline project application, you are going to have to write a different project for each kind of eligibility concern area. So hazardous stumps, hazardous limbs have different concern with their eligibility. So you'll see that in 1 second. There's some additional information you have to gather. But for general vegetative debris on public property and the right-of-ways, you have your basic information that you need to add. So what is the debris, or what was or will the quantity be that is hauled? And this is a part of your whole. So making sure you break down, okay, so I have 100 cubic yards of debris total, but just 25 cubic yards is vegetative debris. The other 75 is going to be construction and demolition. So the information you're going to put here is just the 25 cubic yards. Then you're going to say, okay, estimated or actual. So have I picked up all the debris and I've got all the load tickets and I know exactly how much it weighs or how much it's contained within? Then you're going to be actual. But if you're looking at the debris pile, you haven't quite burned it yet, but you have an idea of how much cubic yardage that is, you can say estimate. So that's just, giving you some context. And then location. So is it throughout your jurisdiction? You're doing one project for all of your debris in the right-of-way. You can say throughout your jurisdiction. If it's specific areas, if you're doing, maybe you're breaking your projects down by neighborhood, or you broke down your tracking mechanisms by neighborhood, you can select specific areas and say neighborhood 1, neighborhood 2, neighborhood 3, quadrant 1, quadrant north, that kind of thing. It'll pop open a box for you to type information into. Address and GPS coordinates. Address, that's pretty self-explanatory. You can enter the address. GPS coordinates, it'll give you a box for you to enter GPS coordinates in to the 6th decimal place. And GPS coordinates should be in decimal degrees. And I know this is a lot of information. Once you get into the Streamline project application, it will have a lot of help text. We also have a Streamline project application category A guide that's in the delivery toolbox for our FEMA staff. It's also uploaded into the grants portal for our applicant and recipient staff. So then what kind of labor, breaks down the different types of labor that you can use, and then staging sites or delivery locations. So for each type of debris, no matter what it is, vegetative, construction, demolition, vessel debris, you have to track it cradle to grave. So where did you pick it up? Where did you drop it off? And how is it going to go basically to the grave? So are you burning it, cutting it, chipping it, salvaging it? So that's going to be for each type that you process, it's going to be cradle to grave for each type. So hazardous trees have to meet 3 main criteria. So the hazardous condition of the hazardous tree was caused by the disaster. It poses an immediate threat to, improved property to your community, and it measures 6 inches or greater at 4.5 feet above ground level. Now that's pretty easy for me. I'm about 5 feet, 5 feet 2 inches, but basically 4.5 feet would be at eye level for me. So it's pretty easy for me to cite off. If you're providing photographic evidence or supporting documentation, you want to make sure you specify that 4.5 foot level, and it'll make your life a lot easier. So in addition to those criteria, you also have to have one of these other 4 criteria met. So more than 50% of the crown is missing or damaged or destroyed. The tree has a split trunk or broken branches that expose the heartwood. It has fallen or been uprooted in a public use area, or it's leaning at an angle of greater than 30 degrees and shows evidence of ground disturbance. So if it's leaning at 30 degrees, those roots may not be exposed quite yet, but as long as you see some of the evidence of ground disturbance, that could be your supporting factor. So if you notice from this particular tree in the picture, I believe it's Hurricane Azelle in Hawaii, but that tree is entirely gone. Only maybe 1 or 2% of it is in the ground. That could be a hazardous tree because it's threatening that sidewalk. So here's what it's going to look like when you start opening up that Streamline project application. I don't know if y'all can hear that, but I just think there's a dump truck going by. So hazardous trees, you do have to have the name of them. That is a requirement. Or if you don't have the names, some sort of way of identifying each tree. So you can't just say 18 hazardous trees in that park. I had to take them all down. You're going to need tree 1, the GPS coordinate of that tree. You're going to need what is the diameter of each tree. So this would be tree 1. Why you had to remove it, so split trunk or a broken canopy or leaning at greater than 30 degrees, and then was or is the 50% more of the root ball exposed, and then how did you remove that tree, and then where did it go, for every single hazardous tree. And again, with the Streamline project application, it has not changed that eligibility requirement. If you normally collect your information in a spreadsheet and upload that, this just creates a way to input the information into the Streamline project application that will then kind of write the project for you. And if you notice in the top right hand corner of this tree section, you can add as many trees as you want. So you're going to have 18 entries for all of those 18 trees in that park. And then you can also have more information in, like I was saying with the Streamline project application, it walks you through the process. Hazardous limbs must be located on approved property. Limbs must be greater than 2 inches in diameter at the point of breakage, and the limbs must be hanging in a tree and threatening a public use area. If they're not still in the tree, they're no longer a hazardous limb, and that's just a part of your regular debris collection. So if you notice in this tree, this picture, this is an example of some damage that was in Mississippi. Some Samaritan's Purse volunteers were helping cut out some of those hazardous limbs. Volunteers are essential to your recovery, but if you do have some volunteers that are helping you cut hazardous limbs, making sure that they take GPS locations of any hazardous limbs or any hazardous stumps that they're cutting down. And that leads me to a kind of a side point. If you do have volunteers, making sure you're tracking what they did, dates and times that they did it, and identifying them by a name, and like what kind of equipment they use. So you still have to track basically the same information of who they are, what activities they're doing, and for how long. So that would be our volunteer mutual aid. Same thing that we tracked with our hazardous tree. You have to identify each limb by a GPS coordinate. You have to identify the diameter of the limb because, again, that is one of the criteria to make it hazardous. I don't have that on there. I believe it's 2 inches, but I can double check that. So what is the diameter of the limb? It has to be 2 inches at the point of breakage for it to be deemed hazardous. Is it hanging over improved property? Is it hanging over a public use area, a trail, sidewalk, or playground? It can't be a hazardous limb that's way back in the park, that's not hanging over a hiking trail. That would not be considered hazardous. And then how did you remove that limb? Next, we'll talk a little bit about hazardous stumps because, again, they have their own special criteria as well. So 50% or more of the root ball is exposed. Must be greater than 24 inches in diameter, measured at 2 feet above the ground, must be on improved property or in the public right-of-way, and must pose an immediate threat. So again, tracking with the stumps, you have to identify every single stump by a GPS coordinates to the 6th decimal place. The system does does accept GPS coordinates in decimal degrees. So if your, Garmin or GPS device is taking coordinates in degrees, minutes, seconds, we have a lot of online. You can find some different tools to help convert that. We also have a GPS conversion. Basically, it's just an Excel sheet, but a GPS conversion Excel sheet in the grants portal under site inspection tools that can help you convert those GPS coordinates. You also have to have the diameter of the stump was or is 50% or more of the root ball exposed, and how did you remove the stump? So did you flush cut it, grind it down, or extract it? It's not an option there, but did you use like stump remover? How are you getting the stumps out? And then the same general questions: what type of labor was used or will be used to remove the stump, and what type of labor was used for monitoring that removal? So if you contracted that out, who watched them? And then where did you take that stump? I know it sounds a little bit funny to say like, oh, you have to watch the people who are doing your contracted work, but it is really important because we want to prevent fraud and waste. It's something we'll cover a little bit more in procurement. Just keep that in mind. So construction and demolition debris are generally eligible if disaster related. Proper disposal of hazardous materials has to be considered. So asbestos, lead, if that is within the construction demolition debris, that's another reason why it's really important to have that separated so that that can be properly disposed of. And then reconstruction debris. So reconstruction debris is not eligible under category A if it's a part of another project. So let's say you have your community center, it was completely knocked down, or we'll say 75% of it was knocked down by the hurricane. If you need to remove that debris to alleviate an immediate threat, that would be the category A. If that debris, if you're not going to remove it until you start reconstructing that community center, that debris would be part of that category E buildings and equipment projects, not a part of a category A project. So this is what that construction and demolition piece looks like. So again, it's this part of the whole. So if you have 100 cubic yards of debris, 25 of it is vegetative, the other 75% is construction and demolition, that's what you're going to put in this section here. It's just 75 cubic yards, or in this example, 1,233 cubic yards. Same questions we asked with the vegetative debris. Is it estimated or actual? Where did you pick that up from? In this example, notice I selected specific areas. So then you have it broken down by, address or GPS locations. You can put whatever you want in this box, as long as it's clear. And then what type of debris, and then where did it go? So cradle to grave for each type of debris. So I said we would revisit this again, and now we have just zoomed up a little bit more. So we've talked about the first two options. Those same questions are going to apply for your appliances and white goods. Same questions for electronics, same questions for hazardous wastes. So just making sure that you're separating cleaning supplies, batteries, and lawn chemicals from, your computers and your air conditioners. And this is what it'll look like in the system. So you have your C&D debris, household waste, hazardous materials, electronics, large appliances, and white goods. So it's all broken down. And the questions for each of these categories looks very similar to the C&D debris list I showed you in the vegetative debris, your general vegetative debris list that I showed you. So you'll recognize it once you get into the system. Eligibility costs. So making sure, so the following eligibility cost criteria apply to direct labor, material, equipment, and contracting costs. To be eligible, a cost must be reasonable and necessary to accomplish the eligible work. So reasonable, necessary, what is that? That can seem kind of like a ephemeral thing. So a reasonable cost is a cost that is both fair and equitable for the type of work being performed. There are a couple of things that establish reasonable costs. So historic documentation for similar work. If you had a hurricane last year, you can use those costs to back up your similar costs for this year. Published unit costs or average costs for work in a similar area. So if your next door county procured costs and you have a similar price contractor, you can utilize that as support. So national cost estimating databases, so something that's published on a national scale. If you want to utilize national cost codes, or you can utilize FEMA cost codes, so that those can all be utilized to adjust to support reasonable and necessary costs. All costs must comply with federal, state, and tribal and local requirements for procurement, and then be reduced by all applicable credits. So salvage values, recycling values. So there is a FEMA Public Assistance Reasonable Cost Evaluation Job Aid, and that's located on FEMA.gov if you have any questions about cost reasonableness. And also making sure that you're following your own procurement guidance as well, because again, that's one of the ways OIG, Office of Inspector General, can take away money, is if you're not even following your own rules or if you're not following the state rules, whichever ones are more stringent. And as a just kind of an overarching thing with cost too, you must keep in mind that the cost incurred that you're claiming must be tied to eligible work. So right here in the top right hand corner, you've got your eligible applicant, remember your facility, work, and then cost is right there on top of that. So if it's not tied to an eligible immediate threat, or if it's not tied to eligible work, those costs would then not be eligible. They all kind of cascade into one another. Questions on eligible or planning? I don't see any in the chat, so I'm just going to go right along. We're going to talk about estimating debris. You can estimate the total of debris, and that can be supported as long as you're making sure you're doing a couple of things. You want to define the area. So are you estimating based on debris that's still on the roadway? Are you in your landfill looking at your debris pile? Have you burnt half of your debris and you're still waiting to burn the other half of the debris, but you're kind of using those two measurements to estimate, what you haven't picked up yet? So making sure you're defining how you're doing your estimates. And if you're doing a comprehensive measurement or a representational sample, going back to the road as an example. So you're looking down a road, you have one debris pile in front of you, you see most of the other debris piles are about the same, estimating or measuring that one debris pile and using it as a representative sample for the rest of the road, and then using that to estimate the rest of the neighborhoods or extrapolate from there, like how much potential debris do you have to pick up the next week. So making sure you're relaying, have you measured every single twig and that's your estimate or measurement, or do you have a sample? Also, what equipment are you using? So when you're estimating, are you using the load capacity of your trucks? Are you using a laser sight or an application on your phone to take a picture of a debris pile and measurements there? Are you kind of sighting it off and providing a visual scale? So what kind of equipment are you using? Coordinating with state and FEMA. So this is general about quantifying debris as well. Sometimes there are debris task forces that FEMA will institute in situations or a large amount of debris, or the state will have their own debris task force or debris removal task force. Are they quantifying your debris for you or helping you with that? So making sure you're coordinating and you know what kind of support you have can really be beneficial. So when you're quantifying your debris in general, so estimates and actuals, making sure that you're taking into consideration all eligible debris that you've picked up in the right of way, but also that could potentially be picked up in the right of way. So if you're 2 months into your event and you're writing your Category A project, you still have told your community you're going to pick up debris for another month, are you including all of that additional eligible debris that you could potentially pick up? And then volume changes. If you noticed there was a drop down that had the volume, so cubic yards or tons, are you measuring everything in feet and then converting to cubic yards? Are you measuring just the trucks and then you want to claim cubic yards after that? So making sure that your conversions are correct. Volume changes can affect the final quantity, and also chipping or burning, so reductions that way. So if you've collected a bunch of debris and you've burned it, and then you're measuring it, so making sure you quantify for that type of volume change. And then generally, just a quick tip, treat debris piles as cubes and not cones. When I was working debris projects, I measured the pile was like a cone, so I measured the angle and gave the rise and run and diameter and all of that. I honestly don't remember anymore. But I turned the project into my crew lead, and he's like, no. If it's higher than 5th grade math, nobody's going to read it. And it also, comes off in your favor as well too. So treating debris piles like cubes, not cones, accounts for all of the space that's potentially within the debris piles, and it's easier to average and compute a cone or a cube, not other than a cone. So making sure you have all the varying heights of the branches and accounted for makes the math a little easier. So some handy estimates that you may see. If you're pacing off a debris pile, make sure you measure your pace first, but a general pace is about 2 or 3 feet. If you're looking at a pile of construction and demolition debris, your washing machine is generally 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. If you divide that by 27, you get about 1 cubic yard. And everyone's seen a washing machine or a dryer. It's pretty easy to cite that off. Some other handy debris in here. 1 acre of debris piled about 9 feet or 3.3 yards high is 16,000 cubic yards. So if you have a large landfill, the height of the pile is a little bit above, the tallest person you know's eyesight or headline. You could have a lot helping you kind of estimate that math, so 16,000. Or another handy estimate would be a house. So if you have your generic cookie cutter white picket fence house in suburban America, a mild hurricane generally produces about 15, maybe not mild, but a more advanced hurricane will produce about 15 to 25 cubic yards of debris, depending on the ground coverage. Same thing with a wildfire. You'll probably have a little bit more or a little bit less, depending on the severity of the wildfire, but you could have the vegetative debris of 15 to about 25 cubic yards. So if you think about it, 1 tree that's down is going to be about 12, a small tree is about 12 inches in diameter. That is going to be about 6 cubic yards total. Medium tree, so that hits our house in small town America quota. So a medium tree that's down about 24 inches is going to be 24 cubic yards. And then a large tree is going to produce about 54 cubic yards of debris when it's all chopped and disposed of. And I have a nice picture there of an app that I cannot name that you can utilize for sighting off your debris as well. Notice it also stamps a GPS coordinate on top of the picture. So that can be really handy if you're tracking hazardous limbs, hazardous stumps, and hazardous trees, because you've got your GPS coordinate right on the top of that event. So debris forecasting for, we'll say, like massive floods, large hurricanes. If the home is completely destroyed, a handy estimate for a mobile home that's single wide, if that home is completely destroyed or burned, it's about 290 cubic yards. Double wide is about 415 cubic yards. A flooded home, bringing that household waste or construction demolition debris, personal property into the right of way. A slab on grade home without a basement is going to be about, thank you, Weaver. I'm just not allowed to vouch for any particular apps. So about 25 to 30 cubic yards. And then if you have a basement, because generally people store a lot of stuff in their basements, so you're going to have about 45 to 50 cubic yards. And again, these are averages. It's not talking about the height of the house. It's just basically, if you think about everything that you have on your ground level and in your basement, it's about 25 cubic yards or 45 cubic yards. We've got some approximate conversions. So we have construction demolition debris, about 1 ton. It's a little bit heavier, than your vegetative debris. You can extrapolate that to 2 cubic yards. Mixed debris, you have about 1 ton. So if you're weighing your trucks, and you've got 1 ton, when they go over that scale, that's about 4 cubic yards of debris. Vegetative debris, you got hardwoods. It's a little bit heavier again than your basic run-of-the-mill leaves and twigs. If you have 1 ton, it's about 4 cubic yards. Softwoods, about 1 ton, is about 6 cubic yards. It's going to be your twigs, your branches, your nice soft woods that you like to whittle when you're in Boy Scouts. And then For one-story buildings that are destroyed or need to be pulled down as debris, take the length, width, and height of that building, divide it by 27, and then you want to reduce that. So you multiply that by 33, and you get your cubic yardage. So that's going to accommodate for all of the spaces and windows and other types of debris that may be included, and that'll get your final estimate. And then a debris pile is your real basic measure in feet, length, width, height, or length, width, depth, depending on your language, and then divided by 27, and you'll get your cubic yardage. Photography tips. Make sure there's a scale. And it seems pretty straightforward, but it's not always. Like if that truck wasn't in that picture, I really would not have a great idea of how big those boats are. Those are some pretty big shrimp boats, but they're not commercial shrimp boats. So they're only about 2 lanes of traffic, 24-ish feet. So making sure you have some sort of scale in there. If you don't, it's going to be really hard for you to look at that picture afterwards and be like, oh yeah, that's X amount of cubic yards, we're good to go. So making sure, even if it's small, or like the stump that we looked at just a second ago with the Solocator app, having that tape measure in it, making sure you have some way to identify the photos, provide a dimensional scale, and that also goes for drone photos as well. I know more and more communities have drones or have access to satellite footage. Satellite footage is also a great way to differentiate disaster from disaster. Not speaking of, but there's a massive internet company that also takes satellite photos. So using, this is actually kind of addressing Richard Will's question. So debris from past events is ineligible, correct? But if there are disasters that are done one on top of the other, you will have to then kind of figure out some ways to differentiate, what happened on, we'll say September 1st and what happened on October 1st. Depending on the area you're in, like I'll use my city as an example, depending on, I'm in an area that has photos taken of it from a satellite, every single day. So it would be really easy for me to demonstrate, like, okay, on September 1st, we had this amount of debris, so that goes with Hurricane A. On October 1st, we had this amount of debris, and so that goes with Hurricane 2, or something like that. So differentiating to the best of your ability. And then on top of that, if you have any issues or eligibility concerns, you do need to talk to your state point of contact or your program or PDTFL. So on that note, it is debris monitoring time. Richard, it is something that if you are having some issues differentiating between the two disasters, you will have to talk to your task force leader. So monitoring is super duper important. It's one of the ways, surprisingly, it doesn't always surprise applicants, but if you don't document, if you don't monitor your contractor that you've procured or the work that you've done, you can potentially get a lot of money taken away. The effort that you expend in this section is going to be really important to track. So FEMA requires that applicants monitor all contracted debris operations to make sure that they can document and ensure to ensure that its contractor removes all eligible debris. And if the contractor is removing several types of debris, making sure that you monitor to ensure that they separate eligible debris from ineligible debris. Applicants are responsible for ensuring debris-related activities comply with all requirements. Reasonable and necessary debris monitoring activities. What you see as the level of effort you need to expend to ensure that compliance is met in all areas. So we do have a level of effort guidance that is available on FEMA.gov and on the internet that I'll make sure gets into this slide deck for when we publish it on Grants Manager and Grants Portal. But debris monitoring is super duper important, and I'm going to let, I believe we have Mark Rushman on here still, I'll let him say a couple words. at the end of this section. So debris monitoring is super important to substantiate public assistance funding. This is where documenting is really important, and even having a plan can help you plan for how you're going to monitor debris operations before it's absolutely necessary, and that's going to make life so much easier for you. It's a way to document compliance with federal, state, and local requirements. And establish, you should have those reporting mechanisms established beforehand or right at the beginning. It's super important to establish some sort of standardized reporting format so that everyone collects the same information every time. All right. Debris, your role as an applicant is the main one. So as an applicant, you have to ensure that all funding, all work under PA program, under the public assistance program, is eligible in accordance with FEMA guidelines. You have to gather all the documentation necessary to support public assistance program funding. So making sure that the work that you're doing is eligible, making sure to document everything, and then making sure that you provide the proper oversight and quality assurance of the debris removal work. And this, you're going to find some more supporting about debris monitoring, I believe, in 44 CFR 206.202. So you're basically tracking who, when, what, and where. So what are the activities that this person is watching? How are they monitoring? Are they like posted up at a debris monitoring site? Are they following the contractor around picking up the debris? How many times do they measure the trucks? How often do they measure and take pictures of the trucks? That kind of thing. So you want to document all of your efforts, no matter what. We also want to, so the state also has some responsibilities with the debris monitoring roles. So the state can take certain actions to ensure applicant compliance with the public assistance program and answer any eligibility questions, as well as other funding requirements. So your state, tribe, or territory may have certain requirements placed on top of the public assistance funding requirements on how they reimburse the money. So FEMA will obligate the money to the state, and then the state closes out and reimburses or obligates money after that to the applicant. So they may have different requirements on top of FEMA. And they also may drop in and do spot checks to make sure that there's the appropriate level of debris monitoring. And that's generally in like large scale situations, large hurricane situations, but it could potentially happen because it is also their responsibility to make sure that you're following PA program rules. And then FEMA's role. So FEMA does reserve that right to make the eligibility determination on top after you submit everything. So FEMA has to ensure that applicants comply with all public assistance program eligibility requirements, as well as all other federal funding requirements. So environmental and historic preservation, so all EHP laws, which we'll talk about in a little bit, have to be met. So that could be another part of your debris monitoring operations, is making sure you don't put the debris, or making sure your contractor doesn't put the debris in a protected wildlife area. This could potentially be accomplished through roving monitoring by FEMA personnel, but it does not always happen. Again, this is really large scale debris removal operations. So there could be monitoring at debris collection, during debris collection, or at the disposal sites. So making sure that you ensure comprehensive monitoring overall. So if you have one debris site, one landfill, you can have monitoring at the beginning and the end of that landfill, monitoring trucks going in, and then as they're going out to pick up more debris. So something that's comprehensive. I'm not going to provide all the examples here because the debris management class is 3 days long and we don't have enough time for that. but making sure at some point you've established that you have comprehensively monitored the entire situation. So, are you following the contractors around, or did you just or were you monitoring at the debris landfill? Making sure to coordinate with FEMA and state personnel, making sure that all of the monitoring activities are documented. Another example of monitoring would be measuring the truck capacities for certification. So, is there a tailgate? Is it a non-structural tailgate? What is the load capacity of the truck? Making sure those are certified. And then managing load tickets. So, how are you collecting the load tickets? How are you tracking the load tickets? Are the trucks being weighed before or they drop off the debris and then before they go back out again? Or are they only being weighed once? So that'd be re-verifying your truck certifications and complying with all monitoring health and safety requirements. So in addition to monitoring the debris activity, are you making sure that your staff, while they're monitoring, are following all the safety and health requirements that they need to follow, as well as the contractor? Are they following all the safety and health requirements that they need to follow? And then document. So documenting all monitoring efforts. This has cost applicants a lot of money. So making sure that you have all of your efforts tracked. Also, so like I said, document. So making sure your documents identify the information that's being gathered. It's really important to have some sort of standardized form. So, maybe even like something you give out to the monitor each morning, you collect it at the end of the day each day, some sort of standard reporting format. Debris load tickets can be used to track quantities if you're basing it off actual quantities, not estimates. But making sure that you know point to point. So are you requiring your contractor to have GPS coordinates of where they picked it up on the load tickets to where they dropped it off? That kind of thing. And then again, documenting everything that you're doing, everything you're tracking. Something that also tends to get people is truck inspection considerations. So making sure that your trucks are certified. If your truck is missing a tailgate or has a non-structural tailgate, you can only claim up to 85% of that truck's certified capacity. So if the truck could hold a maximum of 20 cubic yards of debris, you could only claim a maximum of 17 cubic yards, because that's 20 times 0.85 would be 17. And if that truck could only be filled halfway because it doesn't have a tailgate, so then you could only claim half of that 17, half of that 85%. All right, so I'm going to pause here. If not, I will definitely leave some space for him to comment at the end, and if y'all have any questions on debris monitoring, throw them in the chat, and Mark can also respond to them there as well. Next, we're going to jump into debris removal, about procurement and contracting. So, the last thing we want to do is ask for money back. And again, I know I emphasize that in monitoring, but I'm also going to emphasize it one more time here. Federal procurement rules must be complied with by both recipients and subrecipients. FEMA's Office of Chief Counsel established a procurement disaster assistance team to help assist with all disaster applicants to help them comply with our procurement rules, both at the federal level and at a local level. So you can go and watch the videos. I'll give you that address in 1 second. So procurement is the process of finding and agreeing to terms, acquiring goods or services or works from an external source, often via a tendering or a competitive bidding process. Oh, I see why he wasn't answering. He wasn't in the room. The term contract is generic and includes several different varieties or types. For example, contracts can be categorized by subject matter, so a construction contract, a research contract, supply contract, or by the manner in which they were formed or accepted, such as bilateral or unilateral. Recipients or subrecipients are free to select the type of contract they award, consistent with the federal procurement under grant rules and federal laws, making sure that it complies with federal law, applicable state, tribal, or local laws and regulations, and are within the bounds of good business practice. So there is a field manual published by the Procurement Disaster Assistance Team, and I'm going to ask my co-host Jake to throw that link in the chat. But it is also available on FEMA.gov. Also, if you don't want to go to FEMA.gov, you can go onto your favorite browser or search page and search FEMA Procurement PDAT Field Manual, and it'll show up. Or just PDAT Field Manual. It should be the first or second option there. So procurement requirements. Non-compliance can result in us asking for money back. It can also violate the law. So it may violate FEMA, state, and tribal agreements and could result in financial consequences, including the deobligation of funds. Non-compliance is also, it's one of the most oftentimes we have Office of Inspector General audits. So having your pre-disaster procurement policy uploaded into the grants portal from the get-go will help solve some of your problems. So just making sure that's uploaded and in the system, then your program delivery manager can read it over and you'll be able to solve some of your issues. So we'll talk about time and material contracts. I'm bringing this up because it is not FEMA's favorite. So FEMA reimburses costs incurred using 3 types of contract payment obligations: fixed priced, cost reimbursement, and, to a limited extent, time and materials contracts. The specified contract types are available in the field manual that just got posted in the chat, I think. It's also available you can find the field manual on the website that Jake just posted, which is fema.gov/grants/procurement. So FEMA advises against using time and material contracts and generally limits the use of these contracts to a reasonable time based on the circumstances during which the applicant cannot define a clear scope of work and cost. Time and materials contracts may be used by a non-federal entity when a determination is made that there are no other contract options that are suitable. So, as an applicant, you may use a time and material contract only after a determination that no other contract is suitable, like I just mentioned, and the contract includes a ceiling price that the contractor exceeds at its own risk, and the applicant provides a high degree of oversight and documentation. So we're going back to that monitoring and that documentation. Everything needs to be supported. And then FEMA will generally examine whether the time and materials contract was used for a reasonable time, allowing for a drafting of a statement of work and pricing it out and getting a fixed price or a cost reimbursement contract. So just keeping that in mind, it's not our favorite, but you can still use it as long as it's supported and documented. We also have competition, so making sure that competition is written into the procurement transaction. So as an applicant, you must have written procedures for procurement transactions and must conduct procurement transactions in a manner providing full and open competition. So this is consistent with the standards from 2 CFR 200.319 if you're interested. And Jake posted the electronic CFR in one of the links in the chat. So if you're, ever having difficulty sleeping at night, jumping in and reading some of the CFR, for that, competition is under 2 CFR 200.319. Also, a key thing to remember here is for competition, you're prohibited from using geographical preferences when evaluating bids or proposals, except, because FEMA loves that word, except where federal law expressly mandates or encourages geographical preferences. So if you're in an opportunity zone or working for an example on a reservation or within a tribal service area, you could be required to use geographical preference. Also, another tip about competition: contractors that develop or draft specifications, requirements, statements of work, or invitations for bids or requests for proposals must be excluded from the procurement of the actual contract because just it's not fair. They have a head start. So common contracting issues or non-compliance issues, unreasonable costs, really big costs that just you don't have any backup for, failure to separate eligible and ineligible work, incomplete or vague scopes of work in that contract, if you fail to monitor the contractor's work, some other non-compliance things with the actual contract. If you use non-competitive contracting practices to get that contract, it could be an example of non-compliance. Failure to have any required contracting provisions for your organization or your geographical area. Failure to ensure small, minority, and women-owned firms are given an equal opportunity. And then a use of cost plus percentage of cost contract. So, I know this particular 5-slide section is not going to make you a procurement expert. FEMA's Office of Chief Counsel has established the PDAP, Procurement Disaster Assistance Team, to assist with some of these issues and questions. So recipient applicants must comply with federal procurement rules when procuring goods and services using federal grant funds. So the CFR reference for that is right there up on the slide for all of your procurement purposes. It's 2 CFR 200-317 through page 32 or section 326. Another kind of consideration to have is required contract provisions. There are certain things that you have to build into your contract. So non-federal entity must contain certain provisions, and then you have to do a cost and price analysis. So making sure that there's reasonable costs within that contract. So you must perform either a price or a cost analysis in connection with certain procurement actions, depending on what you're procuring. And I know that's kind of vague, but it is something connected with compliance. So make sure if you have any questions on your procurement document to go to fema.gov/grants/procurement, and that will help you analyze your contracts. So, special considerations. We are in the home stretch here. I'm going to pause real fast and see. I think Mark joined us again. Did you have anything you wanted to say in the last couple of sections? Perfect, thank you. And I'll call on Mark again, and he'll be around to answer questions at the end as well too if I haven't addressed all of them. So for special considerations, we're going to jump into that. Generally, for emergency protective measures and debris removal, so all of your emergency work, there's not really going to be mitigation. So we're just going to talk about insurance requirements and environmental and historic preservation kind of considerations. So The reason why insurance is a special consideration, because we know not all applicants will have insurance covered debris removal covered in their insurance policies, but it varies from state to state. And sometimes even from which natural disaster has affected you. You may have insurance for debris that was caused by a hurricane, but not by a landslide. So making sure that you look at your insurance policy, taking that into consideration, and also know that we do not do duplication of benefits. So if something could be funded by another federal agency or by your insurance provider, it has to be applied to your, you have to apply to your insurance provider first. So FEMA is the funder of last resort. We cannot duplicate benefits. So again, and that's the second point too, making sure you look at your insurance policy, and also if you have any third-party insurances. So is there insurance for some of your buildings but not all of your buildings? Maybe you have insurance on like the debris removal around your facilities, but you don't have insurance for your parks and baseball fields. So making sure that you provide that insurance policy so that your program delivery manager can look it over, or your task force leader, that's going to be really important to speed this process along. Another huge thing, especially to kind of cover what Mark was talking about as well, is permits. So yes, not all landfills can have the same types of chemicals in them. Maybe some are just like vegetative debris. Maybe some can do like regular trash, construction demolition debris, and vegetative, but they can't have hazardous materials. That's going to get into our environmental and historical preservation laws. We also have, so in addition to all those kind of local stuff, we have the Clean Air Act, which is a federal law. So it's, Clean Water Act, what you can put in and around water or take out of the water. Clean Air Act, what you can burn when. There are some places where you can only burn debris on certain days when the air quality is less bad than other days. There's also other considerations like what kind of chemicals can you put into the air, what can you burn, what can you leave exposed to the air. Coastal Barrier Resources Act, again, is about where you can place debris. So making sure you don't have that debris placed in a barrier resource area. Endangered Species Act, again, where you can place debris as well. So making sure you don't put the debris in somewhere that would mess with an endangered species. EO, so Executive Order 11988, floodplain management. Floodplain management is you can't put debris in a floodplain. It doesn't work. Also EO 11990 is protection of wetlands. Cannot put debris in an area that is protected, a wetland area that's protected. This is just important to consider because any of those other executive orders or laws could be a potential EHP trigger, as well as those permits that Mark was talking about. Something really key to remember is EHP issues will vary from disaster to disaster and from state to state. We'll talk a little bit about green sheets. They'll help you kind of determine that. But every project has to go through a EHP review, environmental and historical preservation review. And so these are some kind of triggers that will tell you if EHP may have a particular interest in your projects. So did you get the permits you needed, and are they the correct permits? That is going to be on you as on the applicant to make sure, like Mark was saying, you take the debris to the right landfill, you have the permits for that landfill, making sure that, their permit hasn't expired too. Asking them, like, hey, did you renew last week? So you as the applicant do need to obtain all of those permits. Something key there is we have been asked if so your EHP staff is going to go find that permit, right? No, that is going to be on you. And also if you think about it, you know the community, you know the points of contact, you know who you need to ask for that particular permit. If you don't know, ask one step up or reach out to your local Fish and Wildlife office or your county permits office. They'll know who to ask. Also, any requirements that existed prior to the disaster still apply. You're not exempt from local and state procurement processes. And missing documentation could also create some sort of EHP trigger. So if you're missing documentation that you need, that will slow down the process if you don't have your permits in time. Also, land clearing could be a particular trigger. Working in and around water could be a trigger to EHP. And then making sure that you're not doing any work around a endangered species habitat. So all of these could be issues that could trigger EHP to take a second look at your projects. Some endangered species habitats are like some special areas would be wetlands, waterways or water bodies, or even blue line streams, undisturbed areas, trees. So if there's particular trees that are important to a particular endangered species, wanting to make sure you accommodate for them, and then dunes. So any type of like kind of special area could be an EHP trigger. If there are potential adverse impacts, FEMA will generally consult the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and involve other stakeholders. For a green sheet, it's going to be in the grants portal. Go to your support center, then go to resources, and then if you scroll down almost to the bottom of the page, there should be an environmental and historical preservation folder. Open that up. There are green sheets for each disaster. Like I said, green sheets can be different disaster by disaster, even within the same state. So depending on where you are and what counties are declared, it may affect, migratory patterns or what jurisdiction you're within for your key stakeholders. So it could be that the points of contact are different for your state historic preservation officer or the tribal historic preservation officer. So key federal and state points of contact are going to be listed on that green sheet, as well as other agencies that are working with EHP or that FEMA is consulting. General environmental laws and project requirements specific to the designated disaster area, and any known threatened or endangered species and protected areas or historic facilities that are in the area as well. If it is a statewide disaster, these green sheets can get a little lengthy, but they just are there to provide guidance from EHP, and EHP, Environmental and Historic Preservation, makes a green sheet for every single disaster, generally within a week or two of that disaster being declared. So it's available to you as community members almost as soon as that disaster is declared for you to start planning your recovery process. All right, so other types of debris that we haven't quite touched on yet but are still important. Hazardous materials and hazardous substances can include a lot of different things. So making sure that you're, if you are unsure how to separate them, making sure you ask, your state permitting office or county permitting office, where does this debris need to go? So hazardous waste and hazardous household materials may be eligible. Making sure proper disposal is ensured, especially of white goods and e-waste. All of that additional work that you have to do to dispose of those could potentially be eligible costs. But, if you don't track it, if you don't document it, if you don't make sure it's going the right place, you may lose out on that eligibility. And then also sandbags. Making sure that sandbags are disposed of properly, because when they come in contact with floodwaters, they are considered hazardous. Other types of debris that you may run into depending on the event. So soil, mud, and sand, that's generally going to be landslides, hurricanes, massive flooding events. But some of those bigger events is when you're going to run into sand, mud, and garbage and putrescent debris. Infectious wastes could be in certain circumstances of, let's say, a school or a research laboratory was flooded. That infectious waste needs to be handled in a particular way, as well as chemical, biological, and radiological debris. If it's been contaminated by any of those four, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. So if it's been contaminated, making sure that you understand, or at least ask someone if you don't understand yourself, how to dispose of that debris. So EHP, but in general, FEMA will consult with the proper stakeholders if needed. If it's a large event or if there are some issues, some special triggers, FEMA will reach out to the stakeholders, so state, tribal, and territorial governments, making sure that they have the right resources and understand what they need to know. And also that you as the applicant can reach out to those stakeholders as well before you begin work if it's in a sensitive area. So for buildings and ground disturbing activities, FEMA is required to consult with the State Historic Preservation Officer, the SHPO, or the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, TIPO, before any type of ground disturbing activity begins or any type of rebuilding or debris removal happens in a culturally sensitive site or historically sensitive site. And then endangered species, FEMA will consult with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service for endangered species. For work in coastal zones, there's a couple of agencies that FEMA could talk to, the Coast Guard, National Marine Fisheries, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So it's important to just consult early and often with EHP. That's our general rule. But so as applicants, you can also, like once you acquire the green sheets, find the points of contact, and if you have any questions, reach out. So I don't see any additional questions about special considerations. So let's talk about special situations. We're almost done. Other federal agencies are sometimes consulted during large debris removal operations. So USACE, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Federal Highway Authority, the Environmental Protective Agency, U.S. Coast Guard, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture all have different roles, but they could all potentially play a role in debris removal. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they build berms and levees and potentially still control those berms and levees and are the experts on removing debris from those type of water control facilities. So they can be consulted in that activity as well. As Federal Highway Authority, FHWA, does have emergency funds for debris removal on their roads. So it's really important to make sure you know if your roads are FHWA roads or are under the purview of the county or if they're your local responsibility. So making sure before you claim that debris removal, making sure you're claiming it from the right agency. Because we don't want you to stop from removing it if you need to, but making sure you're submitting the claim to the right place. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, they consult a lot with EHP and also consult about hazardous materials. The USCG, U.S. Coast Guard will help with navigable waterways or with, coastal burial resource areas. And then the U.S. Department of Agriculture, you may be, going kind of, with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I know I first was when I heard about it, but if there's a large amount of agricultural land that is affected, sometimes there will be, USDA will sometimes have a relief fund as well. So these authorities are invested in different ways in the debris removal activities. They can also be brought in by FEMA to do a joint task force or an interagency debris management task force, or they could even be tasked by mission assignment to do some sort of debris removal operations. So that's just in special circumstances when there's a large amount of debris removal, we could bring in other federal agencies. One interesting thing, or one special circumstances for emergency work, it could be under an expedited project. Now, expedited projects are special because they have to be done per the permission of the state. So it can't just be the applicant's like, oh, I need the funding right away, I'm going to submit this project. But you need to request permission through your state, and FEMA may provide expedited funding if there's a high need to get 50% of that federal share into the community as soon as possible. And it's just for category A and B that meets a large project threshold. And it has to be requested within 60 days of the applicant's recovery scoping meeting. The POPG reference is page 184 through 185 for version 2. And that large project threshold for fiscal year 2020 is going to be $131,100. And the new large project threshold for fiscal year 2021 is $132,000, $132,800. So it hasn't changed too much, but just keeping in mind that you make sure you're using the correct large project threshold and the correct Papa G for your events. So expedite projects get 50% of the federal share into the community sooner if it's done with the approval of the recipient. And then FEMA provides the federal cost share for the remaining 50% of the project once the applicant has provided the documentation normally required for either an estimated or a completed work project. And again, there's your Papa G reference. And then we'll talk a little bit about private property debris removal, and then I'll pause for questions. So private property debris removal, again, needs to be done with the permission of the state. My screen is lagging a little bit. Do you see the slide 76? Did I lose power? Oh, nope. My internet connection is unstable. Can you hear me? Okay, cool. If we missed anything, I will go back and cover some additional slides if you want. We'll have probably about 10 minutes at the end. So if debris on private property is so widespread, it threatens public health, safety, or the economic recovery of the community, FEMA may provide PA public assistance funding for debris removal from private property. And that you can look up in your program and policy guide, chapter 2, section 4, paragraph A. Jake's also dropped the media library link, the PDF, the fact sheet in the chat as well. So if you need some additional support there, if you're interested in PPDR and you want to request it from your state, you can do that. These are generally very limited circumstances, and there's usually a task force put together. So you'll know if PPDR, private property debris removal, is able to be requested, because that's something that, FEMA leadership talks with the state, and they set a series of conditions and requirements to that private property debris removal based on the severity of impacts. And remember, costs may not be eligible for public assistance submission if you do not get that permission first. So applicants will submit the private property debris removal request. State and FEMA will review the request and forward that to the federal coordinating officer. The FCO approves or federal coordinating officer approves, and then you can formulate the projects. So that's just a quick how-to. And what you see over in the corner is the SOP, the standard operating procedure, which that checklist is also available online. I believe it's attached to the fact sheet. On that note, we're gonna do the wrap up and final comments. So I'm just gonna pause here real fast. So always, if you have any questions about debris removal and you take nothing away from this class, always take a look at the Papa G, the program and policy guide for your event, and take tons of pictures. There's also a file on FEMA.gov called FEMA Public Assistance Debris Removal Tips. So if you just search that, or you search on FEMA.gov, PA or FEMA PA debris removal tips, you can definitely get a lot of information and tips for that debris removal. So if you take nothing else away, take lots of pictures and look at your program and policy guide. These are some slides that we have to end each presentation with.
If you are working with any documents used for a FEMA grant, you are responsible for safeguarding personally identifiable information, or PII. PII refers to anything that can be used to directly or indirectly identify an individual. Some examples of PII are names, addresses, social security numbers, and financial account information. This type of information must not be uploaded into Grants Portal or Grants Manager. To report corruption, waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement, and/or misconduct, contact the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General by phone at 1-800-323-8603 or via the website or mailing address listed on the screen now. Procurement requirements are among the most complicated parts of the PA grant process, and noncompliance can result in deobligation of funding. Please make sure that you are following FEMA's procurement guidance for recipients and subrecipients. Federal requirements for procurement and contracting are described in 2 CFR Part 200. The Procurement Disaster Assistance Team, or PDAT, offers some training and tools on their website, www.fema.gov/grants/procurement. For technical assistance with Grants Portal or Grants Manager, you can call the PA Grants Portal Grants Manager hotline at 866-337-8448. National hours of operation are 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Eastern, Monday through Friday. In Puerto Rico, hours are 8:30 a.m. to 5 p.m. Atlantic, Monday through Friday. The hotline can also be reached by email at FEMA-recovery-PA-grants@fema.dhs.gov. We have many other recorded webinars and tutorial videos available on our YouTube channel. You can find them by searching for FEMA Grants Portal on YouTube or by navigating to the Support Center in Grants Portal or Grants Manager.